Over the last 2 weeks, we've taken a bit of a deep dive into the 5 cities of Westeros, and also discussed the issue of Westeros having too few cities for its enormous size. One of the running themes in the comment sections of both of those videos was there was actually many fans who assumed there was a lot more than 5 cities in Westeros, and were shocked to find out that some of these places that they thought were cities in the context of Westeros and George R.R. Martin's world building are just in fact large towns that, given their size, by any normal real-world definition of city, should be counted as one. What I really wanted to do is look at some of these larger towns of Westeros and analyse how they grew so big and what it was that prevented them from taking that final step into becoming a city. One thing I do need to clear up before we delve into this is that I know by the real world definition of the word city, these places we're talking about in today's video may very well be counted as one. But we are strictly talking about how George R.R. Martin has seemingly defined cities in his world building and lore, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense from our real world perspective. If he had not gone into Duskendale to rescue Aerys from Lord Darklynn's dungeons, the king might well have died there, as Tywin Lannister sacked the town. Then, Prince Rhaegar would have ascended the Iron Throne, made perhaps to heal the realm. Duskendale had been his finest hour, yet the memory tasted bitter on his tongue. Thoughts of Barristan Selmy, Dance with Dragons, Chapter 67, The Kingbreaker. Arguably, the poster child for this town or city issue is Duskendale, as it seems many fans did actually think it was a city, and it's a very clear example of a large town that at one point was on the cusp of taking that final step and becoming a city. What really changed Duskendale's fate was the establishment and rapid growth of the nearby King's Landing, which slowed Duskendale's growth and prospects to a snail's pace. In fact, the impact King's Landing had on the town runs so deep, Duskendale and by proxy House Darklyn play an arguably large role in the madness of King Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, and thus a factor in the downfall of House Targaryen. Duskendale is a large port town off the coast of Blackwater Bay, located just northeast of King's Landing and the village of Rosby in the Crownlands. The town was formerly ruled by House Darklyn, but after their decimation in the wake of the defiance of Duskendale, it is now the seat of House Riker. Duskendale is centuries, maybe even thousands of years old, dating back to the era of the First Men during the 100 Kingdoms, where the lords of House Darkland were petty kings. Their kingdom at one stage claimed the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where King's Landing sits today, as well as Cracklaw Point. For most of history, Duskendale was sworn to the Durrandons of Storm's End, the Storm Kings, and would often get caught up in the middle of the wars between the Storm Kings and the many kings in the Riverlands. These conflicts only became bloodier after Harren the Black, the king of the Isles and Rivers, added the whole of the Riverlands to his realm and looked beyond the borders at Duskendale and beyond to the Stormlands. Thus, for many historians, it is surprising that Duskendale grew to the size it is today, and that trade prospered given how volatile the political situation was and the constant warring. By the time of the main book series, Duskendale spreads out around its large harbour, with countless cobbled streets from many different historical eras. The castle, known as the Dunfort, originally of the Darklands, now the Rikers, overlooks the harbour itself. The Dunfort is squat and square and made of stones with big drum towers. What really sets Duskendale apart from the many smaller towns is in fact its strong walls, made of stone, with many towns in Westeros having wooden walls, with many not even having that. The walls of Duskendale were as thick and as strong as any of the cities in Westeros. There are also many roads that pass through Duskendale. One goes to Cracklaw Point and Maidenpool. Another key road is the Rosby Road, which is the most direct way from Duskendale to King's Landing, other than by sea. Duskendale, prior to Aegon's conquest, was a prime location for trade in the region that would become known as the Crownlands, with merchants from across Westeros and the free cities across the Narrow Sea often using the port as their main location on the eastern coast. Thus, there's always been a strong foreign population in Duskendale, in particular from Braavos, Tyrosh, and Pentos. If King's Landing had not been built by Aegon after the conquest, it's indeed very possible Duskendale could have become the 5th city in Westeros, but the sudden and rapid growth of King's Landing crippled Duskendale's growth in the last 300 years. Yes, it is still a very popular trade location, but in reality, why would you bother stopping at Duskendale when you could sail a day further down the coast to King's Landing? Duskendale, however, does still benefit from being a stop-off point between ports, but it does not provide the benefit of being a primary trade location. We cannot entirely blame King's Landing for the stagnation of Duskendale. There is another factor, another aspect that is all too easily overlooked. Even before the conquest, Duskendale was either a petty kingdom in itself or being fought over by the Storm Kings or one of the many River Kings. Even as Aegon landed on the shores of Blackwater Bay, Argilac Durrandon and Harren Hor were already disputing the area that became the Crown Lands. Another prime example of how war can affect a city is the damage the Dance of the Dragons did to Duskendale. While the town itself did not burn, the blockade of the Gullet early in the war didn't just cripple trade, but dwindled food supply as well. So war didn't just politically destabilise Duskendale, it affected the flow of trade. Another example of this is seen during the War of Five Kings, but in reverse. King's Landing is blockaded by the fleet of Stannis Baratheon, and thus all the trade meant for King's Landing is diverted and sails to Duskendale instead. It really highlights how the development of King's Landing so near to Duskendale impacted its economy. All this would really come to a head during the defiance of Duskendale in 277 AC, when King Aerys II was held captive within Duskendale by Lord Dennis Darkland, who'd hoped to win a charter and more autonomy for the town, which would have allowed them to set their own taxes and trade levies. If they undercut King's Landing, they could maybe have siphoned off some trade away from the capital. Of course, the defiance failed and House Darkland destroyed, greatly damaging Duskendale in the process. Out of all the nearly cities in Westeros, I believe Duskendale is the closest to have become one. It's large, with a significant population and a good trade location. It had all the markers needed to become a city, if only cards had been dealt differently. The reason we started this video with Duskendale is because it very easily shows us how outside factors influence the growth of towns and cities. But in some cases, as to why growth and development become stagnant is not so clear. When the snows fell and the ice winds howled out of the north, Old Nan said, farmers left their frozen fields and distant holdfasts, loaded up their wagons, and then the winter town came alive. Thoughts of Bran Stark, A Game of Thrones Chapter 37, Bran 5. When it comes to the north, there is only one true city in White Harbour, but outside of White Harbour, even the largest town in the north is relatively small compared to those south of the Neck. A trend you often see in the north is rather than many smaller towns, there is one or two large ones, with a larger part of the population living in smaller villages, with the seat of a lord somewhere close by. While the north is the largest of the Seven Kingdoms by landmass alone, it's one of the lowest populated and the least densely populated as a result, which in turn makes the development of large settlements less likely given a more thinly spread population, be better for using the land for agricultural purposes such as farming. It's not unsurprising concepts like the Winter Town around the walls of Winterfell exist. The small folk of the north will spend spring, summer and autumn working the land and producing food. Come winter, they pool their resources in larger temporary settlements, such as Winterfell's Wintertown, before going back to their villages again come spring to restart the cycle. If the north had a high population, some of these winter towns might have become permanent settlements, as there would be less pressure on the population to spend their time farming. Thus, other trade and vocations could have been developed, which would have built a wider and larger economy, which is why, in war, when a large amount of the northern working age population are taken south or killed, it's often followed by an extremely hard winter and famine, which can be seen very clearly in the winters following the Dance of the Dragons. Even though most of the men who went south were older as part of the Winter Wolves, it still had an impact. Fear is what keeps man alive in this world of treachery and deceit. Even here in Barrowton, the crows are circling, waiting to feast upon our flesh. Roose Bolton to Theon Greyjoy, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 32, Reek 3. The largest town in the north is by far Barrowton, not just in its population, but its size compared to most of the settlements north of the Neck. Given that, it's not a surprise the town is ancient, dating back to the era of the First Men. What makes Barrowton stand out among the settlements of Westeros is the fact the whole town is centered around a large hill known as the Great Barrow, upon which sits the seat of House Dustin, Barrow Hall. The Great Barrow of Barrowton is said to contain the graves of the first king of the First Men, or the King of the Giants, depending on what versions of the tales you believe. The Dustins of Barrowton have been bannermen to House Stark of Winterfell since the downfall of the Barrow Kings of the Age of Heroes. The town is mostly made of wood, with a few stone buildings. The streets are wide and often straight, some even lined with elm trees. House Stout of Goldgrass has a keep near the eastern gate of Barrowton. Barrowton has a modest market and a fine selection of inns and alehouses that do a good trade, given Barrowton is often a stopping point on the road to Winterfell and the Wall when coming from the south. Thus why a handful of Targaryen kings stayed at Barrowton during royal progresses to the north. Given the town lies at the confluence of two rivers, which flow south into the Salt Spear, Barrowton does have a minimal sea trade. Given its location on the road north and on the banks of the river, it does explain why Barrowton grew from a village into a modest town, when other settlements in the north never did. While it's hardly the scale or importance of White Harbour, Barrowton still is an important location in the north, within the context of the kingdom itself, where south of the Neck it might be considered more minor. But if there was ever to be a second city in the north, it would likely be at Barrowton. You need to come south. You need a taste of summer before it flees. In Highgarden, there are fields of golden roses that stretch away as far as the eye can see. The fruits are so ripe they explode in your mouth. Melons, peaches, fire plums. You've never tasted such sweetness. King Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard 1. When we're talking about the Reach, we have another case of a kingdom with one huge prominent city in Old Town, surrounded by villages and towns of varying sizes. The Reach is the second largest kingdom in Westeros, with the largest population for a single kingdom, hence why given its size and population density, there are so many larger small towns and villages whose sole purpose seems to be agriculture and farming, given the Reach is known for being the breadbasket of Westeros, and thus where most of its trade comes from. But given this, as we have discussed, it's remarkably odd that none of these larger towns in the Reach never made the final steps into becoming a city. While the economy is strong in the Reach, being one of the richest and well-off parts of Westeros, it falls into the same issues areas such as the Crown Lands have, where war really has impacted the growth of a lot of these large towns, and has been a direct contributing factor as to why some of them never became cities, and how in truth, some have not just become stagnant, but started to decline. What is interesting about the case of the Reach is much like the Riverlands, it has historically been the battleground for wars of the old kings of Westeros, with the Gardener kings often fighting the Storm Kings to the east, the Lannisters on the northern border, and the Dornish to the south, and possibly even a few River Kings, on and off for thousands of years. Even under Targaryen rule, when things were relatively much more politically stable, there were still many battles fought in the Reach. While most of them didn't leave much of an impact, allowing the rapid growth of some of the towns in the region, the Dance of the Dragons dealt a particularly large blow to the larger towns of the Reach, the kind of damage they have yet to recover from nearly 150 years after the fact. The Reach has some really iconic towns, such as Ashford, as seen in the Dunk and Egg novellas. In terms of large towns, places that very nearly developed into cities, I think there's only really two contenders. The gods will curse all of us for this. Lady Caswell, in response to Maelor Targaryen's death, Fire and Blood, The Dying of the Dragons, Rhaenyra Triumphant. The first is Bitterbridge, an ancient town once known as Stonebridge. It's located where the Manda meets the Rose Road and is crossed by an old stone bridge, given its original name. With its location at the junction of the Manda and the Rose Road, made the market town of Bitterbridge a key location in the Reach for trade, as well as quick access to the port at Old Town and on to King's Landing via the Rose Road. It means goods following in both directions pass via Bitterbridge. While the town itself is not enclosed by a defensive wall, it does host a castle, small but made of stone and thick timber halls. While the keep itself is not large, given the low-lying ground the reach is made up of, it makes it seem much larger than it is. The town also has a very famous inn for travellers passing Bitterbridge on the way from Old Town and King's Landing, called the Hog's Head. The Dance of the Dragons had a huge impact on Bitterbridge, being the site of several tragic events during the Targaryen Civil War, including the brutal death of Prince Maelor Targaryen. The town would be sacked by Green forces as they marched to King's Landing, with much of it being burned, with it forever being known as Bitterbridge ever since. While the damage caused by the Dance of the Dragons did heavily impact the town, it doesn't seem, for the most part, by the time of the main book series, that Bitterbridge has mostly been rebuilt back to its state prior to the Civil War. Not surprising, given its key location in terms of travel and trade. Seldom has any town or city in the history of the Seven Kingdoms been subject to as long, or as cruel, or as savage as a sack as Tumbleton after the treason. Writings of Gildane, Fire and Blood, The Dying of the Dragons, Rhaenyra Triumphant. The same cannot be said for the town of Tumbleton, however. Tumbleton, much like Bitterbridge, is a large market town located 60 leagues southwest of King's Landing, near the Reach's northeastern border with the Crownlands, at the headwaters of the Manda River. Unlike Bitterbridge, it does have a modest wooden wall that encircles the town, but most of the buildings within are still made of wood, with a handful being made of stone. It had many shops, seps and inns, including the now infamous Bloody Caltrops and the Broady Badger. A stout but small castle overlooks the town, with a garrison of around 40 men, not including those who patrol the town itself. Tumbleton, while not directly on the Rose Road itself, is relatively close to it. Given the town size and the access to the Manda, it has been speculated that much of the growth came from goods from King's Landing and nearby areas coming to Tumbleton, then sailing down the Manda to Old Town and vice versa. This is why Bitterbridge and Tumbleton grew into large towns, while others in the Reach, such as Ashford or even Highgarden, themselves remain more isolated market towns or large castles, surrounded by smaller villages to support it. Again, much like Bitterbridge, Tumbleton would be decimated by the Dance of the Dragons, but in a way in which it could never recover, even into the main books. It's a shadow of what it once was. The once prosperous town of Tumbleton was the site of two key battles during the Dance of the Dragons, maybe even the most horrific to take place during the war. The first battle of Tumbleton, Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, two of the dragon seeds for Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen, betrayed the Blacks and unleashed their dragons, Vermithor and Silverwing, upon the town. Lord Footle's men surrendered, but were slain in the process. Much of Tumbleton was burnt to ash by Dragonflame, but a large part of the town was still left standing. Tumbleton was then savagely attacked by the Greens, who were encamped outside the city walls, waiting to march on King's Landing. The leaders of the Greens squabbled for control, as the commander, Lord Ormond Hightower, had been killed in the battle. 13 members of the Greens met in the Bloody Caltrops Inn to conspire against the ambitious Hugh and Ulf, before the Second Battle of Tumbleton erupted into the bloodiest dragon battle of the war, when rivermen in support of the Blacks attacked with Adam Velaryon and his dragon Seasmoke leading the charge. The dragons Vermithor, Silverwing, Seasmoke and Tessarion, with its rider, all took part in the battle, although Prince Daeron was killed before he could mount his dragon, leaving 3 of the 4 dragons without riders. While the Blacks and the Greens slaughtered each other in the streets, the riderless dragons fought each other, burning the town below indiscriminately. All this resulted in 3 dead dragons, and the better part of the fighting men of the Greens dead, and the Black Army now without a dragon or a rider after the death of Adam Velaryon and Seasmoke. But the damage and the death caused to the armies was nothing when compared to the state of Tumbleton, which after being burned and sacked for a second time, was now mostly charred husks of buildings. Tumbleton was famously restored by Lady Sharis Footley, who pulled down the burned buildings and had the town's walls rebuilt, with the heads of Seasmoke and Vermithor put on display in the town square, where travellers could pay a penny to look at them, and a star to touch them. Later Footleys followed Sharis's example, but small folk believed the ground to be haunted, and the new town of Tumbleton would never be a tenth the size of the old one. Between rains, floods, fire and war, they had lost 2 harvests, and a good part of a third. An early winter would mean famine across the Riverlands. Thoughts of Merritt Frey. A Storm of Swords, Epilogue. The Riverlands is where this discussion really starts to get complicated. All you have to do is take a look at the map to see there is a huge amount of larger towns, many of which we have been to in the main books, or at the very least have a significant amount of lore about. But there is a reason for why this fits within George R.R. Martin's world building. The Riverlands is the centre of Westeros, and thanks to the network of roads and rivers that crisscross the whole kingdom, it's almost like a highway for travellers and all the traded goods among the other kingdoms of Westeros. It's not a surprise that most of these towns are located either on key roads or along the banks of the Trident. But the Riverlands isn't just built on the backs of trade passing through it, it's also a trader itself, being one of the breadbaskets of Westeros alongside the Reach. But the Riverlands itself has a huge issue that really has hampered the economic growth of a lot of its towns. The region is prone to being the battleground for most of the major wars in Westeros, which you can clearly see during the Targaryen era. King Maegor the Cruel fought a short war in the Riverlands. Then there was the Dance of the Dragons, where the Riverlands was once again a key combat theatre. And of course, we get to see this firsthand with the devastation caused by the War of the Five Kings in the main books. Towns are burned and the small folk killed, with this bloodshed almost happening on a never-ending cycle. The Riverlands rebuild itself, only for another war to start. Being such a central kingdom, plus the vast networks of roads and rivers, means you would often have to march your army across the Riverlands to meet your foe, with the opposing forces often coming to blows within its borders. But it's much more than that. If you control the Riverlands, you control the ability to move your armies freely across Westeros. You can effectively cut Westeros in two, but you also control all of the resources the Riverlands has to offer. The reason Harrenhal became such a huge target for both the Blacks and the Greens during the Dance of the Dragons is because not only does it solidify your control of the Riverlands, it's also a central location in Westeros you can rally armies from across the Seven Kingdoms to. All this of course takes its toll on the Riverlands itself and its people. When looking at towns of the Riverlands, there's really 5 key places that jump out as towns that are on the cusp of becoming fully fledged cities. In fact, some of these places are so large, many people assume they are in fact cities. I think the most likely town that has come closest to cityship in the Riverlands is probably Maidenpool. Again, for a lot of the exact same reasons. Each of the 5 cities of Westeros are located where they are, the advantage of their geography. Maidenpool, like many of the other larger towns in Westeros, is thousands of years old, with there being something existing on the site of the town since the age of the First Men. The town sits in the eastern Riverlands near the border with the Crownlands and the Vale, situated along the southern shore of the Bay of Crabs, near where the Trident flows into the sea. There are 2 roads leading to King's Landing from Maidenpool. One is faster, which goes through Duskendale, and the other which travels along the coast. As we are well aware, these 2 elements of its geography are vital parts of the formula that foster large-scale growth. Maidenpool is the seat of House Mouton, with their castle sitting on a hill inside the town, protected by Maidenpool's thick stone walls made from eye-catching pink stone. Given its location, Maidenpool has a busy harbour, with countless inns and markets to support it. Fisherfolk northwest of Maidenpool fish the waters of the Bay of Crabs, while the others collect clams along the shore. Maidenpool has also become a bit of a tourist location, with many followers of the faith travelling to Maidenpool to see the famed sweetwater bathhouse known as Jonquil's Pool. The town in fact takes its name from this famous pool, where the legendary figure Florian the Fool first spied Jonquil bathing with her sisters. We don't know what the town was called prior to this, however, with it possible the tale of Florian being a myth altogether. Maidenpool was at one stage a petty kingdom, like many of the other larger settlements of the Riverlands and Crownlands during the Age of Heroes. One of the Storm Kings, Monfred the Mighty, defeated the petty kings of House Mouton to add Maidenpool to his realm for a short time. The fall of Maidenpool and the death of Florian the Brave during the Andal invasion are still recalled through their songs today across Westeros. King Benedict I Justman then added the town to his realm during his reign, with Torrance Teague being crowned King of the Trident at Maidenpool. The Storm King Arlen III Durrandon conquered the Riverlands, including Maidenpool, from House Teague. 3 centuries later, Harwin Hardhand conquered the region for House Hoare, and it would remain under the control of House Hoare until the Targaryen conquest. Unlike many of the towns of Westeros, despite changing hands through several different kings and kingdoms very frequently, Maidenpool was always able to maintain its growth. thus becoming a large town and prominent location that it is during the Targaryen era and into the main book series. That's not to say, however, things were perfect during the rule of House Targaryen. In fact, there were one or two crises that, if they had not been resolved, could have very much damaged Maidenpool. Firstly, Maidenpool suffered the same issues in regard to trade as Duskendale with the rise of King's Landing, with traders choosing the new growing city over the established ports at Duskendale and Maidenpool. But Maidenpool recovered in a way Duskendale did not. During the reign of King Jaehaerys I, trade started to return to Maidenpool, especially when the Master of Coin, Lord Edwell Celtigar, imposed harsh taxes and port fees on ships docking at King's Landing. In turn, these captains looked for other nearby ports, such as Maidenpool, who were much cheaper to trade at than the capital. During the Dance of the Dragons, Prince Daemon Targaryen would use Maidenpool as a base of operations, flying out from the town daily on his dragon Caraxes to hunt down Prince Aemon Targaryen in the Riverlands. It is thought that the presence of Daemon and his dragon might have protected Maidenpool from attack during this time. It seems whenever hard times fell on towns, such as war or winter, Maidenpool was able to withstand it and recover in a way many were not able to. During the War of the Five Kings as seen in the main book series, Maidenpool was captured and sacked 3 separate times, leaving it in ruins. However, the town is actively being rebuilt by Randyll Tarly, who's garrisoned at Maidenpool for the time being, so it looks like the town will bounce back. Now, I wanted to talk about Salt Pans for a very specific reason. It's a reasonably large town and could have grown into a city. But unlike a lot of the other cases of towns in Westeros, we have an in-law reason why it never became one. Salt Pans is another port town located at the very mouth of the Trident as it enters the Bay of Crabs. While a relatively large town with a port, trade was never as strong as other nearby locations. The castle of House Cox dominates the town. It's a small castle, no more than a simple holdfast, with a bailey and curtain wall. There are shops and inns and alehouses by the harbour, as well as a sept and a stables. The biggest industries in the town include fishing, but most of all trading salt across the narrow sea, which has become its primary export, differentiating itself from the nearby Maidenpool and Duskendale. So while it's not exactly a trading hub, it does do good trade with this one specific good, enough to keep the town growing. The reason it never grew into a city is due to the river kings of old refusing to give out charters, which would have allowed towns like Fairmarket, Lord Harroway's town, and Salt Pans to expand and potentially become cities. Now this is really a key bit of information, because while it is a single line in the world book, and may not apply to Westeros post-conquest, it does seem to become a city, under the River Kings at least, a charter was needed. But I do kind of think it would make sense if other kingdoms in Westeros were the same. However, we don't really have any confirmation that this practice was used elsewhere. It's not beyond possibility. Even under House Targaryen and Baratheon, Westeros at large might still use this method of creating cities, which in truth would mirror the real world. I do briefly want to touch upon Lord Harroway's town and Fairmarket, because along with Salt Pans, these towns were refused the charters to make them cities, meaning they are large and prosperous enough to have warranted a charter in the first place. So if we ignore all the economic reasons and impact of war and the disruptions that a years-long winter could cause, at least for these towns in the Riverlands, they never became cities because they were never given the legal opportunity to do so, despite all these other hampering issues. What I do find puzzling about this nugget of lore, however, is it's not as if the Riverlands even has a single city. So why would the River Kings actively choose not to allow towns to become one and gain all the benefits a city brings? My guess is the Riverlands was so politically unstable before the rise of House Hoare and Aegon's conquest. Few of the petty kings had the motivation to invest in creating a city from one of these towns, given how often borders were changing and kingdoms fell. I do, however, feel if Aegon's conquest had never happened, Harren the Black would have gone on and taken the Stormlands, with maybe his descendants trying to take the Reach. But in this situation where House Hoare's kingdom grows that large, I could actually see Harren giving Lord Harroway's town a charter, especially because of its location at the centre of his kingdom and it being close to his monolithic castle of Harrenhal. Dorne is sand and scorpions, and bleak red mountains baking in the sun. Resnak mo Resnak, to Sakaz mo Kandak. A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 43. Daenerys 7. I briefly now want to touch upon other locations that bring some interesting ideas to the concept of larger towns in Westeros, and specifically ones that are basically cities if they were given the chance. When you take a look at Dorne, it does seem fairly obvious why there's a lack of not just cities, but towns in general, with most settlements either very small or effectively castles or keeps. It's all to do with the inhospitable desert terrain. The closest thing Dorne has to a true city is perhaps the Shadow City, built up around Sunspear, with it mostly being made up of mud brick buildings, most often without windows. Stables, inns, wineskins and pillar houses are all found inside the walls of the Shadow City. More hovels have been built against those walls, which has led to the city becoming a labyrinth of narrow alleyways, homes and bazaars. Just south of Sunspear is the Planky Town, a trading town that lies at the mouth of the Greenblood River, near Lemonwood. And while the Shadow City is huge, the Planky Town is in fact the largest and most populous settlement in Dorne. It has a harbour that sees trading vessels stopping off when they're travelling to and from Old Town. He was the scion of House Velaryon, a family of old and storied Valyrian heritage who had come to Westeros before the Targaryens, as the histories agreed, and who often provided the bulk of the royal fleet. The writings of Yandel and House Velaryon, The World of Ice and Fire, The Targaryen Kings, Jaehaerys I. Some commenters in previous videos have correctly pointed out that both Hull and Spicetown on the island of Driftmark had the capacity to have grown into great cities, if history had played out slightly differently. Given the trade and advantageous location in Blackwater Bay, plus how quickly both locations had grown in the space of 2 decades, the same kind of rate King's Landing had managed, it is a fair suggestion. But what ultimately doomed both of these towns on Driftmark is the fall from grace of House Velaryon after the Dance of the Dragons. While the family was still relatively powerful in terms of the local houses of Blackwater Bay, and some of the members would still go on to achieve great things, Driftmark and House Velaryon were never the same after the Dance of the Dragons, which saw both Hull and Spicetown brutally sacked and burned, never to be rebuilt to the same glory they once held. In particular with these cases, it was really Corlys Velaryon and his huge wealth that bankrolled the growth of these towns, and without him and his money, they indeed regressed. The Iron Islands, while it does have some large towns, such as Lordsport, given the geography and difficult terrain of the Isle, and the constant unstable political nature of the houses, development and growth would always have been a challenge. It's why the Ironborn will raid deep into the Riverlands for resources, and why the kings of House Hoare were so keen to make the Riverlands a part of the dominion of the Iron Islands. With the Vale, it makes sense why the city of Goldtown is the only really major settlement, given the difficult geography and climate of the area. Much like the north, the Vale seems to be made up of a lot more smaller villages and holdfasts than larger settlements. However, the Stormlands does leave me a bit puzzled somewhat, and I can't really think of a valid reason as to why there isn't even that many towns in the first place. We know they're constantly warring with the Dornish, the River Kings, and the Kings of the Reach on and off for thousands of years, but even so these kingdoms still manage to grow significant settlements. But this does kind of lead me to the final point I want to make with this video. There is still a lot we don't know about the lore of Westeros. For example, there are many places mentioned in the main book series and in the Dunk and Egg novellas where we have a rough idea of where they're located, but we couldn't place it on a map. For example, Coldmoat or Standfast, as seen in the Sworn Sword. It's very likely there could be many places we just simply haven't heard of yet. We only know the locations of so many of the towns and villages in Westeros thanks to the official maps. Maps I based my own on. The lore we have, while impressive and deep, is incomplete. There are a few things left blank. For me, a really prominent example is the exact location of Darry. Even though we've been there several times in the books, it's never appeared on any official maps, and we only have a rough idea where it's actually placed, thanks to some context clues. The lore we have is impressive and deep, but it is incomplete, and I personally don't think George wants to fill in all those gaps. So yeah, there's a lot we simply don't know, and a lot we will never actually know. But with the information we do have, we can conclude that constant warring, the size of Westeros itself, the low population density of Westeros as a whole, the inconsistent seasons and years-long winters, political instability for thousands of years prior to Aegon's conquest, and well, some extremely harsh geography. It's not surprising why only 5 locations in Westeros became true cities. And while many of these larger towns, such as Maidenpool and Duskendale, are not official cities, I think it's perfectly fine if you want to view them that way, if it helps you make sense of the world a little more. All of this is by design. George R. R. Martin's world building is not perfect, and it is incomplete, but frankly I think that's simply how he always intended it for it to be. As much as I love all the history and lore of Westeros, it's very easy to forget that its purpose is to support the main story the Song of Ice and Fire is telling. As long as it's doing that job, it doesn't have to be flawless, perfect, or complete.